exist. And like Professor Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens is objective. On the atheistic view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, God does not exist. Objective moral values do not exist. But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down, I think we all know it. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Michael Roos himself admits the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. Hence, I think we all know, too, objective values do exist. But then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. Number 4, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. New Testament critics have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come. And as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people would probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just take by faith or deny. But actually, I believe there are 3 established facts which are recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1, on the Sunday following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the historical study of Jesus, by far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent New Testament critic Gerhard Lüdemann, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. Finally, fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite every predisposition to the contrary. You see, Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising, Messiah. And Jewish beliefs about the afterlife prohibited anyone's rising from the dead prior to the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. N.T. Wright, an eminent British New Testament scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. Number one, there are 3 established facts about Jesus: the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. 2, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. 3, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead entails that God exists. 4, therefore, God exists. Finally, number 5, you can experience God personally. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by immediately experiencing him. This was the way people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick explains, God was known to them as a dynamic will interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm or life-giving sunshine. To them, God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experienced reality which gave significance to their lives. Now, if this is the case, then there's a real danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract you from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external proofs that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes an immediate reality in their lives. In conclusion, then, we've seen 5 reasons to think that God exists. If Arif wants us to believe atheism instead, then he must first tear down all 5 of the reasons that I've presented, and then in their place erect a case of his own to prove that atheism is true. Unless and until he does that, I think that belief in God is the more plausible worldview.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm now going to call on Arif to give his presentation. So over to you, Arif. You have 20 minutes as well.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes? And has everybody got a handout? Anybody hasn't? Are there any spare ones? Could you pass them along, please? Thank you.
I think we're out of handouts. I think you brought 150, and I think we've exceeded the number. Unless you've got any spare ones.
Okay, no. Thank you. I do apologise. The handout is in any case not necessary for the bulk of the first half of this part of my presentation, and I'll try to make the second half as clear as I can. Okay, well, I have to begin by thanking everybody involved in this. I want to thank Michael here for chairing the debate, and I want to thank Dr. Craig for coming and so graciously giving the talk that he did, and I also want to thank Ian Cooper, who was behind the impetus for this project. And I want to thank all of you for coming. Now, we're discussing, and presumably this is the reason you're here, we're discussing probably the most important question that any of us will have to face in our life. If what Dr. Craig says is true, if God exists, then you and I should change our lives. If I really believed what Dr. Craig believes, not going through the motions, not having tea with the vicar on Sunday, but if I really believed it, then I would change my life. This, therefore, is a very serious matter, and that fact, I think, has 2 consequences. The first one is that I don't really want to come here and convince you in half an hour or 40 minutes of talk so that you go and think, oh, silly me, of course God doesn't exist. The most important thing I want, and what I think will be the measure of success, and I hope that Dr. Craig agrees with this, is that you should all think about it for yourself. Don't think about what somebody else has told you. Don't think about what you were taught at Sunday school or what your teacher tells you or anything like that. Think about the matter for yourself and come to your own decision. The second consequence is, given the importance of the matter we're discussing, I want to hear serious arguments. I want to hear reasons for believing in God. I honestly believe, and I honestly believe this could be said of most of you today, that if I actually heard good reasons for believing in God's existence, then I would change my mind about it. And if I didn't hear good reasons, then I wouldn't. That indeed is why I think we're here. If we had beliefs which are not based on reasons, then we'd be wasting our time. And this brings me to the first thing that I find slightly puzzling about Dr. Craig. Ian said at the beginning of his introduction that Dr. Craig is a counterexample to the thesis that Christians do not think. Well, let me quote you a passage from a book of Dr. Craig's. This book is called Reasonable Faith, and the passage I'm quoting is from page 37. In fact, there are 3 passages, all from this page. The first one says, "As long as reason is minister of the Christian faith, Christians should adhere to it." Now, minister in this context means servant. So what Dr. Craig is saying is that Christians should believe their reason just so long as it serves the end of the Christian faith. What's the second passage? The second passage says this: "We can know the truth whether we have rational arguments or not." And the third passage, again from the same page, says, "Even though we are given no good reason to believe and many persuasive reasons to disbelieve, even then the disbeliever has no excuse, because the ultimate reason he does not believe is that he has rejected deliberately God's Holy Spirit." Now, it seems to me, if you take those 3 passages seriously, then Dr. Craig must think that we are wasting our time tonight. Because tonight I thought we were inquiring into the question, what reasons are there for believing in God? Dr. Craig's position, however, seems to be that it doesn't matter whether there are reasons. We don't have to think that there are any rational arguments for believing in God. And somebody who is persuaded by reason, somebody who's persuaded by the evidence, even he has got it wrong. So I very much hope Dr. Craig will be able to tell us later on tonight why he thinks we're not all wasting our time being here. Now, I started off by saying that this is a very serious matter, and if what Dr. Craig says is true, then I'm going to change my life. And what that means is that I need to hear serious arguments. This is not an academic word game. This is not just fun. This is not the kind of thing you have chatting over a sherry in the SCR. No. This is a serious question, and therefore I want to hear serious arguments. A student said to me a couple of days ago, "I expect you're very anxious about this debate." And I said, "Why? Why should I be anxious?" And she said, "Well, you know, Dr. Craig will probably have some very strong arguments." And I thought, well, I'm not anxious about that at all. I actually want to hear the strongest arguments he's got. I want to hear the very strongest arguments there are for believing in God. It matters that much to me. So what are these strong, serious arguments? What are these arguments for changing my life? Well, the first one, I've written some of these down. So the first one, Dr. Craig told us that the universe must have had a beginning because there can be no actual infinite. And there can't be an actual infinite because if you take infinity minus infinity, you get a contradiction. Now, as I said, I'm not here to play meaningless word games, and I'm afraid that that is a meaningless word game. It's perfectly true that as far as what are called cardinal numbers